Hi, and welcome to TozziniFreire's podcast, the connection between one of the Brazil's top law firms, a variety of themes under the business law, and you.
Bom dia, hoje é 4 de agosto de 2025. Eu sou Renata Emery, sócia da área tributária do escritório TozziniFreire. E hoje, nesse podcast, eu tenho comigo dois convidados, o Dr. Bruce Zagaris, que é sócio em Washington, D.C., do escritório Berliner Corcoran Rowe, e ele atua nas áreas de direito internacional, que inclui também as práticas de lavagem de dinheiro, sanções internacionais e comércio exterior. E é professor adjunto da Texas A&M Law School. Desde 1985, Bruce Zagaris também é repórter da International Enforcement Law Reporter Magazine. E junto com ele, eu tenho a Vera Kanas, que é especialista em comércio exterior e OMC, e sócia fundadora de VK Law. Vera e Bruce, bom dia. E como nós temos um convidado internacional, eu vou passar para o inglês e esse podcast hoje será todo feito em inglês. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Bruce. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And also, good morning, Vera. It's an enormous honor to have you as well. So, we are here today to talk a little bit about the tariffs that were imposed by the U.S. government to Brazilian imported products. On last July 9th, President Trump announced that additional tariffs would be imposed to Brazilian imported products. And following from then, we saw a lot of speeches from our President Lula about a possible retaliation or countermeasures in accordance with the reciprocity law that was enacted in last April. Then President Trump initiated an investigation according to Section 301, and this investigation is still going on in the United States. And while we were waiting for the outcome of such an investigation, we were surprised last week with the announcement that the tariffs, the additional tariffs, were actually going to be imposed to Brazilian products as of August 6th. So now we have Bruce Zagaris explaining to us a little bit of what were the causes or the facts that led the U.S. government to impose such tariffs to Brazilian products, and what is the potential impact in the United States of such additional tariffs. Bruce, can you explain a little bit to us what's going on?
Sure. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. So on July 9, President Trump announced that he was going to impose a 50% tariff on all Brazilian imports, partly in retaliation for the Brazilian government's prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, and also for the actions of Justice de Moraes against various U.S. online companies. And then there was also on July 30th, there was an executive order issued by President Trump pursuant to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that executive order also imposed the 50% tariff starting on August 6th, although that executive order also exempted a number of products. And so that's basically where we are in a nutshell.
Bruce, a lot of questions rose in our minds when we first heard about the justifications of President Trump, including how the political background could have influenced such decision. And I don't mean only the case against Jair Bolsonaro, but I am referring actually to some of the speeches that our president has made in connection with the BRICS meetings, and a feeling that the U.S. is reducing its influence in the Latin area, and how this could have played a role in the back on this decision of the U.S. government to impose additional tariffs. Also, I have also heard from some colleagues that previously Brazil had a 2% tariff on imports that was raised in April to 10%. And the feeling was that this increase in April was more a reciprocal reaction from the US government, while these additional tariffs, which are above the average tariffs imposed to other countries, seem to be a little too harsh on Brazil. So can you comment on that?
Yes, I mean, this is very complex, but I think simply Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's been living in Texas, he and Jose Figueiredo have been lobbying very intensely, and they already had a prior relationship with President Trump. And as a result of that lobbying, I think that President Trump decided to impose the 50% tariffs. I mean, despite the problems between the U.S. and Brazil, I mean, during the Biden administration, relations had improved a lot. In fact, Lula visited the U.S. And so I think this is really very personal between President Trump and Brazil. I mean, it's more Trump and Bolsonaro as opposed to Trump versus Lula.
Okay. Vera, from the Brazilian side, can you talk a little bit about the repercussion of this new additional tariffs?
Yes, Renata, as you mentioned, Brazil used to be, exports from Brazil used to be subject to very low import taxes in the US, right? Because when we are talking about tariffs, we are talking about the import taxes applied in the US. And it used to be, those tariffs used to be very low, lower than in Brazil, for example. Okay, so the tariffs used to be quite low, as you said, like 2%, not more than that. And then in April, based on the Liberation Day and the reciprocal tariffs, the list that President Trump announced that day, Brazil was subject to 10%, which was additional tax applicable to the exports from Brazil to the US to be paid by the US exporters. But this means that the products from Brazil, coming from Brazil, would be more expensive for the US customers. But the exports from Brazil would be subject to 10%. 10%, which would be the baseline, like the minimum that was imposed. So Brazil in the beginning was like, wow, we have to do something, what happened, etc. But then we are subject to lower taxes than our competitors like India, like China. So China was subject to 145%, while Brazil would be subject to 10%. So wow, so not so bad for Brazil. And Brazil was in a position as we would like to negotiate, but let's stay in the shadow. If we are not seen, so better for us. We are going to sell. And then it was a view that Brazil would sell more to the US than Brazil thought, because of the taxes applicable to other countries. And Brazil was subject to these lower taxes of 10% because the emergency act that was the basis for the reciprocal tariffs was based on an existence of deficit with the trade with the US, and Brazil does not have US does not have a deficit with Brazil, because the US sells more to Brazil than Brazil sells to the US, so Brazil would be subject to 10% only, and then the Brazilian industry would be accommodated in this situation, thinking that it would be like a definitive scenario, which was not. So this is what happened at that time. The only industry that was putting some pressure on the Brazilian government after April at that time is steel, right? Is the steel and aluminum industry in Brazil, because Brazil exports a lot of steel and aluminum to the US. So, but this is not, and then the tariff applicable to steel and aluminum was 25%, and then it was raised to 50%, which is bad for the Brazilian industry. But still, there is a view that Brazil was selling these products to the US. And the tariffs applicable to steel and aluminum is not the reciprocal tariffs of 10%, but it's subject to the 232 Section Trade Expansion Act of 62 investigation that led to this. It's another legal basis not related to the reciprocal tariffs that is lead to this additional taxes of 50% nowadays. And then Brazilian things were going on, and then all of a sudden, let's say, a letter from Donald Trump was issued on 9th July, as Bruce said, and it was funny because for us here in Brazil, because it was not sent through a diplomatic way. It was simply published in a
social media platform.
The social media. So people were thinking, like, is it true? Is it not? So I was wondering. I spent like 2 hours checking if it's a fake news or not, if it was correct or not. So from the Brazilian side, it was difficult to understand. And that letter, as Bruce said, it was arguing that there was a problem with persecutions against President Bolsonaro, against big techs, and also there was a text about an alleged deficit. And this is was really strange. This is why I thought it was a fake news, because there is no alleged, and it was proven that there was no deficit by the figures, of course, and by the fact that Brazil was subject to 10% of the reciprocal tariffs, which was the baseline. So it was all these matters that was strange. Of course, this alleged deficit, it was because of the legal basis related to the reciprocal tariffs. The Emergency Act at that time was because of the existence of the trade deficit or not. So for this reason, it took some time for the US government, I believe, to check which would be the legal basis for these 50% tariffs against Brazil. And this is why it took some time between 9th July until 13th of July to develop this legal basis, let's say, against this, so as to enable these additional tariffs against Brazil. And eventually there was this executive order of last week, a few days ago, creating a new emergency act only against Brazil. So this is specific for us, with these arguments against the persecution against big techs in Brazil and access from Alexandre de Moraes. So all this environment of that is kind of political, but that would enable to be the legal basis for the application of these tariffs against Brazil, saying that there is the reciprocal tariffs of 10%, and this new legal basis that enables the application of additional 40% as of next week, 6th August, in principle. Okay, so everything that we say
Vera,
is for today.
Vera, but I think that I heard that there was, let's say, it was a bittersweet decision in the sense that there was a very large list of exceptions. So a part of the private sector was relieved with the executive order that was issued last week. And it feels that there is room to negotiate additional exceptions. Can you
Yes, so this
just make a brief comment on that?
Yeah, very good point, Renata. In fact, there was mixed feelings, of course. This is the only subject now in Brazil, is the main subject. Everyone now is an expert on tariffs, on international trade. It's very good to hear that. Since the 9th of July, the industry, the Brazilian industry and the government, they were all desperate about this matter. There was some kind of blame game between the left and the right at all political levels, who would be blamed for this. And in the industry, there were like this uncertainty, and this is the main impact for Brazil, is the uncertainty of what's going to happen, because today we have the 10% and we don't know what's going to happen next. So there was a desperation from the Brazilian industry. And then when it came with this emergency act against Brazil, there was this establishment of the additional tariffs, but there's a long list of in the annex with exceptions. And this is why there was the main feeling at that day, of course, now is a relief, because I thought that the scenario would be much, much worse. And then the main products that Brazil sells to the US were subject to these exemptions, such as oil, pulp for paper, at the aircraft sector, and also other products that Brazil sells a lot to Brazil. One of the main ones are like orange juice. They're out of this application of the additional tariffs of 40%. Okay, but there are still some products that are part of the list of the main products sold from Brazil to the US, like coffee and meat, and also fruit. That is not in the exception list, so it is subject, would be subject to this 40%, and that Brazil is studying how to negotiate and with the private sector. So the relationship with between government and private sector to improve the law during this period, the last weeks. And also the main view is that it's a time to negotiate. No retaliation is on the table yet, so we can talk later about what the retaliation could be from Brazil to the US, but there's no such a view for the time being. But today we could see some news that the government Lula is sent to CAMEX, which is the Chamber of Foreign Trade of Brazil, a proposal to authorize the Minister of Foreign Affairs to take this issue to WTO dispute settlement mechanism, so as to challenge this mechanism of raising tariffs to be against the WTO rules. This is not retaliation, it's using the multilateral system to deal with this matter.
Bruce, tell us a little bit. Vera just was saying that the justifications used by the U.S. government to impose those tariffs, at least in the beginning, mentioned a deficit which we know does not exist between Brazil and the U.S. In fact, the exports from U.S. are greater than imports from Brazil. So I heard from some colleagues that there are some lawsuits in the U.S. against the increase of the tariffs, and mainly focus on that specific issue. But can you tell us a little bit more about those cases and how are those cases being developed before the the U.S. courts?
Sure, there are a number of cases. So there was a case brought by a interesting mix of both conservatives and globalists in the Court of International Trade. And there was a decision in May by the Court of International Trade, a unanimous 3-0 decision that Trump does not have authority under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose tariffs. That act only allows the president to restrict or to regulate imports and not to impose tariffs. So right away, the government appealed, and the appeal was heard just last week on July 31 by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And in the oral argument, and it was heard en banc by 11 of the judges. So you could tell the court wants this case to move quickly, the fact that it had the entire court hearing the argument. And they expressed skepticism of the US government argument. It's likely that in anywhere from a month to 6 months, we'll have an opinion from that appellate court. Meanwhile, the day after the Court of International Trade ruled, the US District Court for the District of Columbia also ruled, and the court in the District of Columbia also ruled that the president's action to impose tariffs under IEEPA was illegal. That case is also on appeal, and both of the appellate courts stayed the ruling so that the tariffs continue for the time being. There are also lawsuits in the Ninth Circuit, that's on the West Coast, brought by the state of California and other states. And also on July 18, Johanna Food, which imports Brazilian orange juice, they brought an action declaring that insofar as the tariffs impact orange juice from Brazil, that is illegal. Now, probably that case is going to be moot because the July 30th executive order has exempted orange juice. And I think also that lawsuit shows the utility of bringing litigation, both with respect to the executive order and also with respect to the initiation of the Section 301 investigation.
Just to say that I fully agree with Bruce that the lawsuit from Johanna Food worked very well, because I don't think that the orange juice would be in the exception list otherwise. Yes.
Bruce, I also heard that there is a possibility that the U.S. government will take these cases up to the Supreme Court, and this would cause the cases to take longer than expected, and until then, tariffs will still be imposed. This means that the harm would be already in place for the Brazilian companies, for the Brazilian exporters, because there wouldn't be an ultimate decision until the Supreme Court rules the cases. So even if it rules in favor of those companies, it would have took a long time, like 1 year, 1.5 years, until the cases are closed. And this is something I would like you to comment, but I would also like you to comment on another side of this dispute. which is the fact that the U.S. importers are requesting refund of any tariffs or would have the right to a refund of any tariffs that have been unduly collected in this period. So can you comment on these two sides of the disputes?
Sure. So it's likely that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to ultimately decide the case, and that will likely not happen until probably the summer or the fall of next year. I mean, because it will take 6 or 9 months for the Supreme Court to, have briefs, have oral argument, and before they make their decision. And it's hard to know how the court's going to rule because, we all know that the court is very conservative. It has been very favorable so far to President Trump. However, the coalition attacking the tariffs is a very unusual coalition. There's a lot of conservative and progressive groups. So let's see, the second question you asked was
about the ability to have a refund in case the
Oh,
court
yes.
rule in favor of the importers.
Yes, so the government had to agree as part of the request for the appellate courts to stay the decision that it would allow refunds. So there will be refunds, but even the whole process of refunds is very uncertain. How long it'll take, how it will work, partly because the customs agency only has so many people. There are so many tariffs that they're going to be overwhelmed with the number of refunds, and some of the cases will have been liquidated, some will be unliquidated, so it will be very messy and very uncertain just how the refund process works.
So it's fair to conclude that even with this, let's say, possibility to challenge the tariffs at courts and to have the refund in place in case the companies win their, obviously, in case they win their cases, the sole fact that President Trump has enacted this executive order has already caused a lot of harm to Brazilian industries. And obviously, this is a situation that will still go on for at least 1 year, which would be very harmful for Brazilian exporters. So in the best case scenario, or the best course of action here would be to negotiate additional exceptions, because this could be an easier or quicker way to solve, at least in part, this issue. Do you agree with that, Bruce?
Yes, I do. And by the way, the harm is not only to the Brazilian exporters, there's big harm to the entire American economy, which is slowing down. We're in a process of what's called stagflation, low growth and inflation at the same time. But yes, negotiation, the best way would be for Brazilian exporters and for Brazilian non-governmental organizations to collaborate with US importers and with US non-governmental organizations to lobby the executive branch and also to lobby Congress. I mean, I know just last week, 8 Brazilian senators did that. They came to Washington, and also 19 Brazilian non-governmental organizations came to Washington and did the same thing. So I think they should, continue with the pressure and the negotiation, and that will result in at least some products being exempt.
the only thing is that what is being said under that emergency act are things that is difficult for the Brazilian government or Brazilian private sector to offer. Like this negotiation would be in which the basis for this negotiation is hard to know, because one cannot exchange lower tariffs or more exceptions against terminating the process against Bolsonaro, or so this the basis for these emergency acts and what Brazil is being accused of is very difficult to, like, it's not a tradable matter and to be under negotiation. This is can be difficult.
This is a good point, Vera, because actually we do believe that that's why when we started this whole conversation, I said we do not believe that Bolsonaro is the actual outcome that Trump wants to have with this whole negotiation, because it's not negotiable at all. We have separate powers in Brazil, and the executive branch, the Congress cannot interfere with the judicial powers, so the case will still go on. And the same thing goes for Alexandre de Moraes. But on the other hand, we've been hearing talks about the strategic minerals and the lands, the rare lands, and things like that that could be on the table. Can you comment on that, Bruce?
Yes, I mean, so on July 9th, there were no exceptions. On July 30th, in the executive order, 40% of Brazilian exports were exempt. So that shows that regardless of what happens with Bolsonaro or de Moraes, the executive branch is willing to negotiate. What has to happen is U.S. importers and U.S. trade associations, they have to go to the executive branch and say, look, if you don't exempt, for instance, coffee, that's going to make U.S. inflation go up even more. And Mr. President, that's what you ran on, was getting inflation down, especially food prices. So, that's an example of the type of negotiation that has to occur and that can occur to, exempt various products, notwithstanding whatever happens with Bolsonaro or the beef against de Moraes.
And when we look at what the EU or what Japan, the negotiations involving Japan or the European Union, for example, they offered it was like promises to buy more from the US or investments in the US, but mostly it's more of how can a government to promise to invest in another country? It's difficult to think, right? So there are some things that it was already implemented, a mix of what was already implemented and some wishful thinkings. So it depends on the case. The only thing is that because for Brazil was not a deficit justification, let's say, but a more political and things that are not negotiable, Brazil has to be more creative on what could be offered back.
Exactly.
Bruce,
Exactly.
so we saw that soon after the announcement by President Trump of his will to increase the tariffs on Brazilian products, there was an investigation under Section 301 that of the Trade Act that was initiated in the U.S. And the justifications were fairly different from the ones that have been given by President Trump. We had these investigations being initiated on the grounds that our electronic payment system, the PIX, would cause harm to U.S. To the competition of U.S. entities. There was some environmental things that were also called on those justifications. So our concern here is we want to understand a little bit more how this investigation will develop or is developing, and what could come out from that investigation. What kind of additional sanctions could be imposed to Brazil in connection with that?
Sure. So part of the investigation uses the national trade estimates, which the U.S. Trade Representative does each year. And so the national trade estimates, they said, okay, U.S. products have difficulty because of, for instance, intellectual property protection problems or ethanol market access. So there's a period until August 18 in which interested persons can submit comments. I checked 2 days ago and there were very few comments from Brazil. The only
Really?
comments were from, someone in Mississippi talking about the problems of Brazilian wood imports, and I think it's very important for Brazilians to submit comments. There will be hearings on September 3 and September 4, and then the U.S. Trade Representative will make a decision on whether Brazil is unfairly or unreasonably taking action that harms U.S. exports. And if so, then the president can do things like impose tariffs. So essentially, the 301 action is another legal way in case Trump loses the IEEPA order, which so far he's been losing. So the 301 is another way to justify legally imposing tariffs. And there have been cases where the Court of International Trade has said that the U.S. Trade Representative did not take into consideration enough the comments that were made during the investigation. And so this is why I think it's important for Brazilian exporters, Brazilian NGOs to submit comments, to appear at the hearing, and to say, look, some of these allegations are not true.
Bruce, can you mentioned that there were some comments from someone from Mississippi. Are those the sole comments from the U.S. side? Because obviously, if U.S. multinational or companies were also reinforcing these allegations, we would be more worried. But if I understand correctly, if I hear correctly from your side, there are no other or additional, let's say, negative comments, remarks from U.S. companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, so far, the negative comments have come from two people engaged in wood, saying that Brazilian wood, unfairly undercuts American producers of wood. I think there were one or two comments on the digital payments, and that's all that I saw that was adverse to Brazil. But on the other hand, I didn't see anybody that was trying to be, pro-Brazil. And, I think that's also important in terms of the investigation and the outcome.
But when it comes to the outcome of this investigation, can it be something else from the tariffs? Can the U.S. impose other types of sanctions, or should we expect, even if the outcome is negative, which we do not expect that, but even if that is the outcome, can we expect something else, additional sanctions or not?
I think it's going to be tariffs because that's what Trump wants. And it's likely that the USTR is going to find that the USTR is going to find what the president wants. And so, I mean, but if the US trade representative doesn't do it in the right way, there can be litigation and the court can overrule the USTR. And all of these things buy time. They buy time for negotiation. So, I mean, the whole utility of the investigation, if you're a Brazilian exporter, or if you're a US importer, or myself, if you're a consumer of acai or castanha de Peru, is, you know, it gives you time to negotiate to try to get exemption for some of the products that you want to come in.
Vera, you wanted to come in and make a comment.
Yes. From the Brazilian side, the first comment is that the impression from Brazil is that it was it would be an alternative. The first feeling, okay, that it would be an alternative to to the tariffs based on all that explanation from IEPA. But it should not be seen that way, because the tariffs under IEPA were effectively imposed, expect to be imposed, so the Emergency Act effectively came. So I maybe some sectors in Brazil were underestimating this section 301, because they're not going to go forward because the Emergency Act was worked. So, but it is not to be seen that way, because they can result, it's not really an alternative, but they can accumulate, as in the case of China, for example, they accumulate. So there is the section 301 investigation was effectively initiated, and it can lead, as Bruce said, to something that Trump wants, more tariffs. And so unless there is many claims in favor of Brazil, so because Trump wants something, the USTR will find something and will impose based on intellectual property protection, anti-corruption enforcement, etc. All these issues that is being claims for the past 20 years. But illegal deforestation, so all these justifications, let's call, can result in additional to tariffs that can be additional to the IEPA tariffs. And I talked to some experts that say that the real risk with this 301 investigation is that it's very hard to take them out, because they have a legality procedural background. So they are very hard to be removed afterwards, because they are not like political as the IEPA tariffs. So they can be applicable to an indefinite time, for like forever. It's very hard to, because they are meant to be removed as soon as the matters are addressed. So for example, if the PIX is an issue, so until Brazil removes the PIX, the tariffs can be in place, for example. And also because there is no limitation for the additional tariffs. The tariffs can be 100%, 200%, 1,000%, which would be the necessary to address the matters. So there's no limitation in terms of level of tariffication, and no limit in terms of time. So this is the main risk related to the 301 investigation. That is maybe more difficult for Brazil to deal with that than the IEPA tariff, because the IEPA tariff, as Bruce said, is being under discussion in the judicial level. It can be go down, but the 301 section tariffs, they have a legal basis. The stronger that the 301 section allows for the imposition of tariffs, and it's very hard to remove afterwards.
Exactly. But and there are a couple of points, the reasons for the 301 investigation, for instance, such as anti-corruption interference. I mean, that can easily be refuted, because certainly Brazil has some issues with anti-corruption, but in the last 20 years, the Brazil position on anti-corruption has improved greatly. The US and Brazil have all kinds of joint settlements on anti-corruption cases, which show the U.S. only does joint settlements with countries that it trusts, that have good anti-corruption policies. Similarly, on illegal deforestation. I mean, most of the illegal deforestation happened during Bolsonaro. I mean, Lula, you can criticize some of Lula's programs, but compared to Bolsonaro, Lula has, tried to take action on illegal deforestation. So there are a number of areas like this that Brazilians can make a difference in the 301 investigation, but they have to hurry up because they only have until August 18 to make comments and until September 3 and 4 to participate in the hearings.
I am really surprised to see that there are very few comments. There should be more, Bruce.
So let's
Exactly.
just change subject. Let's talk about a little bit about the Magnitsky. So last week, President Trump or his administration imposed or included the name of Justice Alexandre de Moraes in the Magnitsky list. And I would like you, Bruce, just to comment a little bit on that. What could be the implications for Justice Alexandre de Moraes and those around him derived from his inclusion in this list?
Sure. So the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, which was enacted in 2016, authorizes the U.S. government to impose sanctions on foreign individuals and entities responsible for serious human rights abuses or corruption. And so Justice de Moraes is alleged to have engaged in serious human rights abuse, including arbitrary detention involving flagrant denials of fair trial guarantees and violations of freedom of expression. And the sanctions can include visa bans, asset freezes, and the act also allows for the termination of sanctions under specific circumstances, and it applies to not only Justice de Moraes, but his immediate family. Now, I'm told that Justice de Moraes doesn't have any U.S. accounts. He doesn't even speak English. He doesn't travel to the U.S. He's like a middle-class Brazilian person. And so I don't think these sanctions are going to have an impact on how he conducts his work. And I think, frankly, the use of the act to try to interfere and obstruct the judicial processes of an independent sovereign country is an abuse of the act. And I think it undermines the integrity of the act. I mean, the act was meant only for serious human rights abuses and serious corruption. So it's named Magnitsky after the person, the attorney in Russia, who represented a dissenter who was being prosecuted. And it's only used very rarely. The rest of many other countries in the EU, Australia, and Canada have their own Magnitsky Act, and they would never use it in a case like this, even though I know there are, it's controversial, the actions of Justice de Moraes, but it's unprecedented to use the act in this way.
Bruce, but there was some discussion here in Brazil and some doubts by Brazilian banks that have agencies in the US, whether those sanctions would also restrict their ability to have accounts and to, let's say, conduct transactions involving Alexandre de Moraes merely because those banks have agencies in the U.S. And another thing was about the credit card, the international, let's say, flags of credit cards that would also be affected by this Magnitsky Act. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, yes, that is a what normally happens when the U.S. issues sanctions is banks in other countries, they also sometimes will take action to block the accounts of the persons who are sanctioned. And so, I mean, every country does this differently, but sometimes banks are worried that if they don't block the accounts of the people that are sanctioned, that those banks may also have difficulty with the United States.
Okay, because what we heard is that the Brazilian banks have issued a kind of consultation to the U.S. government to clarify if those measures would also be imposed or would also be extended to them since they have agencies in the U.S. And can you also comment if because we know that the visas from other members of the Supreme Court have been suspended, and also from the members of Alexandre de Moraes' family. I read on the news just today that the U.S. government intended to expand the Magnitsky Act or sanctions to the other justices of the Supreme Court. And I was just in doubt if those sanctions would also apply to the members of Alexandre's family, I mean the financial sanctions, or if for them it would be limited to the visas. Can you clarify?
Just complementing what Renata said, what we hear also in Brazil is that there would be an intention to extend these Magnitsky Act or other kind of sanctions also to members of the Congress, of the Brazilian Congress, so as to put some pressure. What do you think about that possibility?
Okay, well, with respect to the other members of the Supreme Court, the U.S. Treasury would have to specifically name them, and that hasn't happened yet. But the visas of the immediate family of de Moraes, they are immediately impacted. They cannot travel to the U.S. In terms of extending it to the Congress, this would be, quite unprecedented. I mean, President Trump has done some very unusual things, very unprecedented things, but extending the Global Magnitsky Act to the Congress, that would be, quite unprecedented. In fact, I mean, the one person in the Brazilian Congress who has apparently violated U.S. criminal law is Senator Eduardo Bolsonaro, because under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, you can't lobby unless you register as a lobbyist with the U.S. Department of Justice. Now, on February 6th, Pam Bondi, the new Attorney General, issued a memo deprioritizing the enforcement of that law. But there's a 5-year statute of limitations. And so if Mr. Trump is not still in power in 5 years, the statute of limitations would not save Senator Bolsonaro from potential criminal prosecution for failing to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Bruce, just a
but-
final question here for us to finalize, to conclude our podcast. Do you see how can Justice Alexandre de Moraes solve this issue? Would he have a recourse to the judicial branch in the U.S. to try to remove his inclusion from the list? Do you see this as a viable way, or isn't there any other action but on the political side?
I mean, normally what happens is if you're listed, you first have to apply to the Office of Foreign Assets Control to delist you, or to get a license to unblock enough of your money if the Brazilian banks block his accounts, so that you can do certain things that are necessary in your life. Failing that, you can also bring a lawsuit. But it is very, very difficult, because when you bring a lawsuit, U.S. courts tend to favor, these are national security issues. And so it's difficult, if you're a sanctioned person, to use litigation as a means to get you off the list. I mean, normally you have to show Treasury that either the initial reason was unjustified, or that you have changed your conduct so that you should no longer be listed. And that's a very, it takes, in some of the cases that we have now, where we've tried to get people off the list, it takes 2 or 3 years for the Office of Foreign Asset Control to even process your applications.
Wow. So, any final remarks, Bruce?
I would just urge Brazilians to participate in the 301 process, and also for professionals to engage their U.S. counterparts, so that U.S. persons can understand what's going on in terms of so-called illegal deforestation or anti-corruption in Brazil, so that Americans can understand what's going on in Brazil, and that there can continue to be collaboration between professionals in the two countries, so that hopefully political leaders will have more sense in terms of their policies.
Just remind our audience about the terms that we have here to engage in the 301 process.
Oh, you mean the dates?
Yes.
Yes, so it's August 18. You have to make comments. And also until August 18 to say you want to participate in the September 3 and September 4 hearing that the USTR is going to have. And if you want, I can send you the link so that they can get into the portal of the USTR.
And also for the hearings, I understand that it would be at least advisable for Brazilian companies that want to engage or want to be in the meeting, in the hearing, to engage a U.S. firm, right? To help
Exactly.
them with the whole, yes. Process.
Yeah, it's good to collaborate with U.S. lawyers, U.S. importers, U.S. NGO, so that there can be a robust effort by all the interested people.
And do you have clients, Brazilian clients that are already, or U.S. importers that are already asking your advice on this, asking your help on this?
Yes, I have a couple of law firms from Brazil that have requested advice on behalf of their clients. And so, I think this is going to be, I think there's going to be more in the coming days, because there's a lot of Brazilian products that are impacted.
Vera, would you like to make some final remarks?
Yes, yes. Just to say that the main impact in Brazil, as I said, is the uncertainty that it brings, all these foreign legal bases, foreign political decisions, foreign that it comes from abroad, but impacts our daily lives it will be, in my opinion, in a kind of definitive manner. It came, the world changed, and it's not, in my opinion, it's not all about Donald Trump. It just accelerated some things, but some things that were happening before, and Brazilian companies and Brazilian people in general, and the rest of the world as well, we have to get used to this new, let's say, new order in international trade.
Very nice. So for all of you who stayed with us until now, I wish a nice day, and and thank you very much, Bruce and Vera. It was a very nice chat that we had about these tariffs and the Magnitsky law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.